Welcome back to Gunsmith Part 6. This is by far the hardest Gunsmith that I've ever had to do, because at the moment, Peacekeeper and Mechanic are locked to level 1. Once these open up to level 2, this is going to be an awful lot easier, and it's almost pointless me showing you this gun, because it's going to depend on exactly the combination of parts that you've got as to how it's going to be done, unless you have ref and a lot of GP coins. So I will go through that first, but before we go through any builds, there's one thing you have to do no matter what build you're doing, and that is get a Fortis shift. If you have a Fortis shift already, then don't worry about this part, obviously, but if you don't have one, there's only one place to get it outside of raid, which is this barter here, the SIG MPX on Mechanic 1. It's this barter, and when you do it, you get a Fortis shift, and you can then use this on the build. So you pretty much have to do this no matter what you do. So the easiest way is to use ref, as you might imagine. This is always seemingly the case, unfortunately, at the moment. You have two builds that allow you to complete this almost immediately. The first one is the AKM. This is pretty much exactly as you need, and the Fortis shift just needs to go on the bottom. The only thing that we're missing is a suppressor. Now, fortunately, the OPSKS build has a suppressor that is also compatible with the AKM, which is the DTK4M. So what we'll do is we'll buy both of these if you want to do it via ref. Edit the build. This is the easiest way. Underneath here, you put an M-Lock 4.1 inch rail under the Zhukov. Then in here, you add the Fortis shift. And then on the front, on the muzzle, you basically want to just take off the muzzle brake that they've got on at the moment. Take off the 308 adapter, and you want to add this thing, the TTAK, the Tactica Tula muzzle, and over the top of that, we're going to add the DTK4M. This build will work and just needs to be handed in, but obviously if you don't have loads and loads of GP coins for ref, because these things are quite expensive now, we basically got up to 111 and 91, so this is going to break the bank if you don't have arena, then you're going to have to do it a different way. Now it is useful to know that the DTK4M exists on here. You might be able to scrape together 91 GP coins if you don't have the suppressor, but there's a couple of sticking points about this particular build if you're not going to use ref, and I will show you that now. So we're going to start again with a Prapor AKM. We're going to edit this build. There's three parts that we absolutely have to have. We need the Fortis shift underneath, connected to some handguard. We then need the magazine, which we can add now because this is non-negotiable. It is this Magpul PMag 30 Gen M3 30 rounder, and then we also need some kind of suppressor on this weapon as well. So the Fortis shift, we know where to get that from. The Gen M3, if you're not going to use the AKM build on ref, the other two ways to get it is Peacekeeper 2, which we don't have at the moment. You can get one from the mutant that you get from Two Great Heights Part 2, which is a ref quest line, and you can probably get to that actually using the trial that you get for 3 days after you complete balancing Part 1. You can also get it from boss guards, maybe find it in raid, something like that. Look on Fence. Fence is quite useful for some of these parts. If you go over onto a Fence occasionally, he does have full builds with items that you can't get hold of yourself. So for example here, the VPO 209 has got an AK-100. That's not particularly special. And every now and then you find different builds with different things. So it is a little bit variable based on what you actually see on Fence, which is why I don't really want to recommend using that. But this can make the builds easier if you're eagle-eyed and pick something out that you might need. For the time being, I'm just going to stick it on an AK-100, and I do want to point out that this build is not to be done bit by bit. I want you to watch this video first and understand how this build gets put together before buying any components. Don't go and buy anything yet, because you need to figure out what's going to happen with this based on what you've got. So we've got to solve the Gen M3, which we talked about already. We've got the Fortis shift, and now we need a suppressor. The suppressor is probably one of the hardest parts about this, because previously we used to use this, the Hybrid 46 thread mount adapter, which can be bartered at Mechanic 1, but the Hybrid 46 itself cannot be gotten until Mechanic 2. If you have Mechanic 2 at this point, if you're watching this later, then you can barter this for 4 sticks of RAM, and that's not a big deal. Loot a load of PCs and you'll be able to get it that way. But without the Hybrid 46, this makes the build a lot more tricky, because the Hybrid 46 has one of the best ergonomics of all of the AKM suppressors. And in this particular Gunsmith, we're really hamstrung by ergo and not by recoil. I'm just going to remove the rear sight now, just to make things easier later on. But really, there are 6 suppressors that you can get for the AKM. You have the Hybrid 46, you have the Rotor, this one, 762 sound suppressor, you have the Hexagon AKM, and the PBS in the standard set. The PBS is the worst of all of them. This is the lowest ergonomics of them all. You then have 2 separate ones under the Tactica Tula mount, which is the one that we looked at already, the DTK4M, and the alternative, which is the DTKP. These two have exactly the same stats, and they sit somewhere in the middle between the PBS and the hybrid. I'm going to put on the DTK4M because I think this is probably the most likely that people end up using ref to buy the SKS to allow them to get one suppressor. But if you don't have any of these suppressors, there's nowhere else you can buy them, so you're just going to have to find any one of them. Now from here, there's lots of different ways that you can go about this build, and there are some things that save the build if you have them. I mean, you don't have to mess about anymore. Some of the most impactful mods at this point are the stocks. If you have any of the Zhukov S, this one, the UAS AK, this one, and this has to be the AKM one, by the way. There's one for the SKS that doesn't fit. And then there's also this one, the OP4. If you have any of these three, they have such high ergonomics, they're just going to dominate the whole build and allow you to finish it. Even the Zhukov, which has the least at 12, makes this build trivial. So they've got 12, 13, and 14 ergo. So with the Zhukov, you can see you have 42.5 ergonomics, which makes this extremely easy to complete. If you're missing a point or two here, then you can watch the rest of the tips to understand what to do. If you don't have the Zhukov, or any of those other stocks, then you're going to have to do something a little bit different. The next most bang for buck part is handguards, depending on exactly which one you have. There's a couple that have super high ergo. The one that you're really looking out for is this one called the Zhukov U. This comes in lots of different varieties. You've got Zhukov U in plum, you've got Zhukov U in black, you've got Zhukov U in FDE. So there are 3 of them to keep an eye out for, but they all look vaguely the same. And you can see here, these have 14 ergonomics, which over the AK-100 handguard is another 9. So this is the next best after those amazing stocks. And if you have one of these guys, you can then do the M-LOK 4.1 inch rail, and then you can add the Fortis shift onto that, and that gets you super close to the 40 ergo that you need. Failing that, let's put this back to the AK-100. It's then going to be on the pistol grips. So the pistol grips can go all the way up to +8 compared to the base, but this one is pretty rare and quite hard to find. So alternatively, the next best thing that you're probably going to get is one of many, many ones that have +12 ergonomics, which is the US Palm, the RK3. This is probably one of the more common ones because this actually can spawn on scab weapons, things like the Saiga 9 and stuff. So you want to go and check fence for these. You can use the Scorpius. This is also +12. You have the MOE AK. This comes on various builds in the games. This one's also relatively common. You have the TDBG. This is the default grip on the RD704. So if you find one of those guns, you could take it off there. You also have the Tango down in FDE as well. So there's 2 flavors of this too. Any of these will give you a big step up. So you can see here, that's going to add 6 and get us quite a lot closer to 36.5. Now let's just assume for a second that you've been kind of unlucky with your pickups, or you've had to sell loads of stuff because you're on a standard account and you haven't kept many weapons parts because you didn't think there was much point in modding, and you might end up with a build that looks something along the lines of this. You've managed to get a suppressor of some kind, you've managed to do the shift barter, you've got the Magpul Gen 3 from somewhere, and you've got a saw pistol grip at least. This is probably the minimum viable part that you need to actually make this build work. At this point, there's lots of little things that you can do to bump yourself up. You're going to want to check through the rest of the handguards first. So I have one of these, a B10M handguard with a B19 mount, but make sure that you've got the best handguard on that you can before you start doing this, because you don't want to go on overkill if you don't need to. So the little parts are, if you change out the AK in wooden stock, you can change this for an AK-74 poly. This one has 2 extra ergo from the AKM and bumps you up just a little bit. On the back of this, you may have found a butt pad and may have kept this around, and this is going to give you another 2 ergonomics as well. So you can stick that on there if you have it. If you don't have it, don't worry, there's other things we can do. Instead of the top rail, usually you would go for the Bastion. The Bastion gives you no extra ergonomics, but if you have a dog rail instead from somewhere, this gives you +7 rather than +5. So that gives you a little tick up to 39.5. From here, you can add this little thing, which is the RP1. This gives you +1 extra ergonomics, and then we're going to have to add a scope that gives you 800 sighting range. The one that I usually tend to use, because you can buy this straight away, is the Romeo 7, but I would point out that this one gives you -3 ergonomics, and there is one that is slightly better that also has 800 sighting range, which is the Bravo. We can't access the Bravo right now, but if you do have a Bravo, this is -2 rather than -3. So this is very slightly better if you have a Bravo. This is the stage where it gets really tricky because it depends on exactly which suppressor you've got. As I said, the PBS is really the worst one, and this one makes it very difficult because this means you've got to catch up another 7 ergonomics to make this work. Even if you do all of these tricks, you have a butt pad, then you've got to do something else to get this extra 5. So here you can get this knurled charging handle. This is quite rare, but you might have picked up in some boxes. That gives you 3. So you can try that. But failing that, you're basically going to have to find some combination of handguard and pistol grip out in the raid that allows you to reach 40 ergonomics, because this really is the sticking point. So in terms of handguards, the Fortis shift gives us 8. So we're looking for anything like MOE AKM, something like that. You just need to be able to find some parts that's going to allow you to get up to that level. So even an RS47, this comes on Peacekeeper 2 normally, you can then add on this shift grip instead. That gets you 37.5. So then you've got to find some more points either in here, so swapping over to one of these other ones which is slightly higher, finding a Bravo and the knurled charging handle, something like this. You need some combination that's going to get you over that 40 mark. I think one of the easiest parts to find is probably one of these handguards, because you do find them on boss builds and that kind of thing, like B10M, B19M. You often find them on fence as well. You can find builds like that just out there on fence. And if you do manage to grab one of those, that makes it 10 times easier, because once you've got the shift on there, you've got quite a lot of room to play with. So we could even go down to the RP1 with this one. We could swap this back to the regular cheap optic that we could buy from Skir, which is the Romeo 7. So this one would work. This would be an AK-74 poly with butt pad, an MOE AK, the standard stock, the RP1, which is standard. We did have to upgrade to the dog rail from a raid build, the shift onto this B10M that we'd also find in Raid, and the PBS suppressor. But this is probably the worst case for a build because the PBS is the worst out of all of them. So if you have the PBS one, you are slightly cursed and you're going to have to find loads more of these parts. If not, if you don't have one of those, then you can get away with some of these less parts. You don't need the dog rail, you can do with the Bastion. You won't need a butt pad, you can just leave it off. You won't need the MOE AK, maybe you can just get away with the saw pistol grip or something. So this is the issue with this build, is that you're going to have to fiddle around and see what you've got and see what you've got in your stash in order to build it up together and make it work. But broadly, this is the fundamental kind of framework as to how to think about building this thing. But without using Ref and not being able to use Mechanic 2 and Peacekeeper 2, this build is really tough. Just for argument's sake, I'll show you the build that I've got. DTK4M, the shift grip which goes onto this B10M, B19, which I'd saved up. I am just using a regular Bastion and a Romeo. I've got the AK-74 Poly and a butt pad which I'd saved from elsewhere, a saw grip that I've saved from elsewhere, and a Gen M3 that I've saved from elsewhere. So that's how my build is working for this. Obviously, Ref is the easiest way to do this by a long shot, but I'm going to go and hand this build into Mechanic. I'm going to get onto Gunsmith Part 7, and hopefully it's not quite so hard.